Okay, for our job today, we're doing a 2004 Grand Am. We're going to be doing a front wheel bearing on it, and these are tools that we're going to need. One of the most important tools is going to be a good torque wrench. This is a 1/2-inch drive clicker style torque wrench that I use. Works very well. 1/2-inch breaker bar. I use these to make sure that all the lug nuts are tight after I put it back on the ground, and occasionally have to use it to break loose the hub nut. 1/2-inch ratchet, good quality stuff. One quick note on your tools, make sure you've got some decent quality tools. The cheaper ones have a tendency to break at the worst possible moment and cause the greatest amount of pain. 19mm 1/2-inch drive deep socket, getting the lug nuts off. 36mm hub nut socket. 13mm wrench. We've got a regular and a ratcheting one. I'll probably use both. I also have a 12mm wrench. We use that for the caliper bolts. Good ratchet with a 13mm socket and a 3-inch extension. 1/2-inch impact gun. Not a necessity, but a good idea to have. Makes it a whole lot easier. A little bit of, I use synthetic braking caliper grease. It's good for high heat areas and something you definitely want to use on a job like this when you're putting the brake pads back together. A couple of different size screwdrivers for popping clips apart wherever you need to. Bungee cord for hanging up the brake caliper either way. Regular hammer, piece of copper or brass or something that you can use between the hammer and different pieces with threads on them in case you got to get them out of the way. And of course the BFH. This is a really big hammer. Sometimes you need something a little bit beefier to get some parts off. That's all the tools we need for this, so let's get started. Now that we've got some of the snow off the car, our next step is going to be to get the front end in the air and verify that we actually have a problem with the wheel bearing. I'm using a rotary 14,000 pound drive-on lift, so it's got a couple of jacks in the front that we use to lift the front end up. Now of course, if you're not using a system like this that automatically stops the car from rolling, you're going to want to make sure that you block the wheels first. Next thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you've got your jacks actually locked into place so that it doesn't accidentally come down on you while you're working on it. To confirm the diagnostic of a bad wheel bearing on most cars, there's a couple of different methods you can use. The first is to shake the wheel and see if there's any actual play in it. Now, there's a lot of things that can cause play in a front end. Tie rod ends, ball joints, wheel bearings, and the like. Typically, a tie rod end is only going to play in a horizontal fashion. The tie rod end will only move like this. If you don't feel any play in it like that, then it's definitely not a tie rod end. It also might not be a wheel bearing. You check for vertical play. We don't feel any vertical play in it either. That tells us A, the ball joints are good, and we still don't know about the wheel bearing being good or not. A couple of other symptoms of a bad wheel bearing are an ABS light coming on. A lot of wheel bearings, such as General Motors like this one here, have the ABS sensor built into the wheel bearing. Because the sensor is built into the wheel bearing, when the wheel bearing starts to wobble, it can cause damage to the sensor, and it can pick up little pieces of metal that make the sensor no longer work, because the sensor is effectively a magnet. Another really good way to check and see if you've got a bad wheel bearing is put one hand on the coil spring and rotate the wheel. If you feel a grinding noise in the coil spring, that wheel bearing is bad. You can check it against the other side just to see how smooth it should be. I can feel a grinding in this one. I'm going to say this wheel bearing is most certainly bad. Step number one in the replacement of the wheel bearing, pull the wheel off. General Motors, as most General Motors products, has 19mm wheel lugs. That's on cars. Trucks are going to be a little bit bigger. So we've got our impact gun with our 19mm socket on it. We'll pull those lug nuts off first, place them aside, and gently persuade the wheel off. Now we've got a better view of everything. The next thing we're going to have to take off is going to be the brake caliper and the caliper mounting bracket. To get the caliper off, we're going to use our 12mm ratcheting wrench. We're going to remove the two bolts that hold the caliper to the caliper bracket. Here's the top one, and here's the bottom one. Once those two bolts are removed, set the bolts aside, and we should be able to pry the caliper off. I usually use a small bungee cord to bungee cord the caliper up out of our way so that it's not hanging on the brake hose. That can cause damage to the brake hose and problems in the future that you really just don't want. If you can't find a bungee cord, a coat hanger will work just as well. Next step is to remove the brake caliper bracket. Now in doing so, we're going to have to pull the brake pads off. These ones are in pretty good shape. Make sure you remember which one's on the inside and which one's on the outside. The inside one will typically have a circle where the caliper piston is ridden, and the outside one will have more of a U-shaped mark on it where the outside of the caliper matches up with it. There's two bolts that hold the caliper mounting bracket on. One here and one here. They're usually on pretty tight, but once you get them broken loose, they usually come right off. On this particular vehicle, it's a 13mm ratcheting wrench, or you can use a socket with a ratchet to get these bolts out. Another interesting tip for getting a little bit more torque out of your wrenches so that you don't have to grab a ratchet with a longer handle or a bigger ratchet is to double up the wrenches. When you do this, you don't want to use the ratcheting wrench to be the one that you're putting all the torque on, because they have a tendency to break. A lot of times they won't warranty them out if you've done something like that. So what we do is we're going to use one wrench on the bolt, take our other wrench, hook it inside it, and effectively double the amount of torque that we've got on. Makes the bolt a whole lot easier to get off. Now is also the perfect time to check your caliper mounting bracket to make sure that your slides are free and rust free. This one you can still see has got a little bit of grease on it if you look real close, and it moves no problem. Got a good rubber boot on it, no brakes in it, so you know it's going to last for a while. Other side, same thing. Everything works real good. We're in good shape. The calipers, the pads slid out real good from the mounting brackets, so this is in pretty good shape. We'll be able to put it right back on. If the pads were stuck inside the caliper bracket, you'd want to make sure you clean them up real good with a grinder or a sandblaster if you have it, or something to get the rust out of there. Make sure the pads fit in, and we'll be able to move real good in the future. Now you can remove the hub nut. The hub nut's usually a special socket that a lot of people wouldn't normally stock in their garage, but sometimes you can get them on a loan type of program from your parts store. A lot of parts stores will do that. You'll have to leave a deposit. You get to be able to use the tool, and then when you bring it back, you get your deposit back. This one's a 36mm socket to get this particular nut off. Now, when you're doing these nuts on the end of the CV shafts, the hub nuts, when you take them off, it's okay to use an impact gun. When you put them back on, you do not want to use an impact gun. It can damage the new bearing. You don't want to have to do this job twice. That's probably going to be pretty hot by the time you get it off. To free the CV shaft from the hub itself, you're going to want to bang it out. You do not want to bang on the end of these threads because you'll damage them, you won't be able to reuse them. So typically what you want to use is a copper or brass hammer, or a piece of a brass hammer, or a chunk of copper or brass in between the threads and the hammer that you're striking it with. This will save the threads on the CV shaft so you can reuse them. Once you feel it move a little bit, it's free, everything's okay, we can proceed with taking the bearing off. On this particular model, there's 3 bolts that hold the wheel bearing on. You can see one here, there's another one up here, there's another one around on the other side. These all have a 13mm head, and there's some pretty hefty bolts. Best way to get these bolts off is with a 13mm socket with a 3-inch extension. The 3-inch extension will give you enough room to get behind the bulk of the CV joint so that you can turn it without the ratchet making contact with the joint itself. Again, these are usually pretty tight, but once you break them loose, they come apart pretty easily. Another thing to remember is you can move the CV shaft out a little bit if you need to. You're not going to be able to get it all the way out at this point until you get the wheel bearing loose a little bit more. Or if you need to, you can always push it in a little bit too. A couple of things on our side, on this side, that are going to require our attention. The first is the plug for the ABS. We're going to disconnect that and move that up out of the way, and then we'll be able to see right behind it the last bolt holding the wheel bearing in. Sometimes a screwdriver is useful in popping the ABS sensor off of the bracket. And you can probably see that the bolt's loose, but it's still in there. It's not attached to the wheel bearing anymore. No need to pull it all the way out. No sense in wrestling with it. Best off leaving it where it is because it's just going to have to go right back in anyways. Here's the exciting part. This is why you needed to eat your Wheaties this morning. We've got our BFH, and we need to remove the bearing from the housing. We've got all 3 bolts out of it. We've got the CV shaft disconnected. Moves freely in there. Honestly, the best way to go about this is with a little heavy persuasion. Of course, be careful you don't hit anything on the car that could cause any damage. You just want to strike the bearing itself. Hopefully the hub will stay attached to the rest of the bearing and it'll be able to come out nice and easy for you. This car's got 120,000 Buffalo miles on it, so I'm not really counting on anything. We might get pretty deep into this one. Or we might get lucky. Came apart in pieces, but here's the wheel bearing, or most of it anyways. You can see this is the exciter ring on the inside for the ABS and the bearing itself. Often the case, these come apart in pieces. Take this bracket off, remember how it goes on, so you can put it back on the same way. Then the difficult part, getting the rest of the pieces of the bearing out. A good way to do that is to go from the inside with a screwdriver or some kind of chisel and a hammer and knock them outward. Now you can see the rest of the sensor mechanism and the rest of the bearing, and finally the wire for the ABS that's going to come out. To get the plug out around the CV shaft, sometimes you have to push the CV shaft in a little bit and hold it off to the side, make room on that side for the wire to come out. There we have the rest of the bearing. Now we're ready to clean it up and put the new bearing in. Okay, we've got our new wheel bearing here. They usually make a couple different cost ranges of wheel bearings. This is a more expensive one. The cheaper one, I've seen them go bad in as little as a week. Save yourself a lot of heartache, pony up the extra dough, get the better bearing. You probably won't regret it. Now if you remember, there was a flange behind the wheel bearing. Remember to put that back in. That's with the tab facing inward. So, loop the wire for the ABS inside of there. And make sure it goes back in the same position that it was in. Wire for the ABS is up in the 2 o'clock position. Where it clamps on is in a similar position. Basically, once you've got it all cleaned out, it should just slide right in and bolt on. Once you've got it into place, you've got the wire through for the ABS sensor, roughly where it's supposed to be. You can go ahead and start the bolts. Don't torque them one at a time all the way down. Get them all started and snugged up before you start putting too much torque on. The reason I say to snug them up all individually is because you want it to go on nice and flat. If it's cocked a little bit, you can do damage to the ears where the bolts actually go into it. Once you've got them all snugged up, then you can go ahead and torque them into place. There is a torque spec for this, of course. There's a torque spec for every nut and bolt on every car. These ones, it's not quite as important as a spindle nut, so we're just going to make these nice and tight. Okay, those are all tightened up. We're ready to put the ABS sensor back in where it belongs. Now if you remember from taking it apart, basically it's going to point downward. This little metal clip is going to fit into this bracket. A little hard to see on the video there. Try and get a closer shot of it. Again, a screwdriver might help with a little gentle persuasion. Then of course, plug back in the other end. On the car side, you should hear it click into place. It's got a little rubber grommet in there. Make sure the rubber grommet's still in place. And check the wires, make sure they don't make contact with anything as the wheel will be turning. For now, we're going to start the nut on the spindle. But we're not going to bother trying to torque it all the way down yet. We'll wait till we've got the brake on for that. I'll show you a little trick why we're going to do it. Having that started, we're going to go ahead and put the rotor back on. Lining up the holes, of course, and making sure there's no detritus in between, rust or little pieces of metal or things like that in between the hub and the rotor itself. Then we can go on ahead and put back on the caliper mounting bracket. Again, you want this to go on squarely, so don't over tighten one side or torque it all the way down until you've got the other side all snugged up. Usually push the rotor in, make sure it stays in place for you. Some guys like to use a lug nut just to hold the rotor in place. It makes things a little bit easier. Makes a little bit more work, but having to put a lug nut back on and then take it back off again. Now it's snugged up, I'm going to use my ratchet to tighten them up. I like my trusty ratchet. I'm used to it, and it gives me a really good angle for this. Again, there is a torque spec. We're not going to worry too much about that. We're going with tight. Now that we've got the bracket on, we can go ahead and put the pads back in place. What I like to do is using my good high temperature grease designed just for this purpose. Grease up the pads a little bit, only where they match up to the caliper mounting bracket. You do not want to put grease on the pads themselves. It will not increase your horsepower or your top speed. It will make it so that you cannot stop. So, again, the one with the U shape on the back of the pad, it's a little hard to see there, but you can see there's kind of a U shape to it. That's on the outside, and the one with the circle in the middle of it is on the inside. Now you can see these pads are almost worn. This particular customer is going to be due for a brake job in the near future, but cost being an issue, we're not going to be doing that right now. Of course, you want to make sure that the brake pads go on nice and easily by hand, using any kind of a hammer or device such as that. Once you've got them in place, go ahead and put your caliper back on. Now, you shouldn't really need to compress the caliper because we're putting the same pads back on, so it should just squeeze right on. Sometimes what you can do is work it back and forth a little bit and get it to open up a little bit by hand. Once you've got it in place, go ahead and put the bolts back on and hold it in place. We're back to our 12mm wrench. Same deal, snug them up before you tighten them too tight. Make sure that everything's lining up real nice and the rotor turns fairly freely. Once they're snug, go ahead and tighten them up. Don't go crazy on these because they're small bolts usually. And you can break them easily if you're not careful. Now it's time to go ahead and tighten up the spindle nut. Got our 36mm socket for the time being. I'm going to use a 1/2-inch ratchet to put it on. A little trick, take a screwdriver, stick it into the caliper in such a way that it'll stop the rotor from turning, so that you can go ahead and apply the torque to the spindle nut. Usually it's a locking nut. It takes a little bit of effort once you get past a certain point. That's why I'm using this big 1/2-inch ratchet. It just makes life a lot easier. Now we're going to take our 1/2-inch torque wrench. The torque spec for this is 173 foot-pounds. Usually you can get this from your parts store or wherever you happen to buy the bearing from. They don't charge you for the information. If not, there's a bunch of different forums online where it's pretty easy to find. This particular car, like I said, 173 foot-pounds if you have the solid gray nut. If you have a black nut, there's a slightly different procedure for it, so make sure you follow it. Typical torque wrench, you've never used one before basically, you're going to want to torque it until it clicks, and then do it again. And that's it. Now, make sure when you put your torque wrench away that you take it all the way back to 0. I'm not going to get into how to set up a torque wrench at this point. Maybe at some point in the future if a lot of people request a video such as that. All the way back to 0 when you store it. Move your screwdriver. Now a quick check over everything just to make sure that we haven't forgotten anything. Everything looks good, we can put the wheel back on. Make sure you always start your lug nuts by hand. For anybody who doesn't realize this, if you try and start them with a gun, 90% of the time it'll work fine, and 10% or more of the time it won't work fine and it'll give you more problems than it's worth messing around with. So once you got them started by hand, here I have a policy where every nut gets hand torqued, so we'll put this back on the ground. I'll go over them with a breaker bar to make sure they're torqued to a point where they'll be able to come off if somebody needs to on the side of the road. They'll be able to get them off with just manual strength, and make sure that they're on all the way and tight. It's a good way of doing a second check on something to make sure that it's good to go, and this is one of the important things to worry about. Okay, we've got her back on the ground. We've got the lug nuts all hand torqued. She's all ready to go. One last thing to remember, every time you take the brakes apart on anything, make sure as soon as you start it up, pump that brake pedal a few times to make sure the pressure comes up to where they're supposed to be. Otherwise you could run into a big problem trying to back it out and then suddenly find that you don't have any brakes.